Well, as Benny said, today I'm here to take you on a virtual tour of Tate Britain. I am a Tate guide, so it'll be the one of the rooms that I normally take people around. In fact, it's the room containing the oldest paintings in the Tate collection. But I've decided to take a particular theme while going around the paintings rather than just talking about each one. And the theme today is the role, that is the improving role and status of the artist over this period, which spans from the Tudor through to the Stuart period. And remember that at this time, the reign of Henry VIII was the high Renaissance in Italy, with artists like Raphael, Michelangelo, Titian, and so on. But in Britain, it was very different, as we shall see. Now, imagine you're walking up the stairs, and I'll just about to get out my my floor plan, my map of the Tate, in order to guide you to where we're going to start. Now, I'm sure you all know the Tate and have been there many times, but just to remind you how to get to the room we're going to be visiting today, we go up the stairs and through the entrance, past security, round the rotunda, and down the Devine Gallery. That's this the 300-foot long neoclassical gallery that was funded by Lord Devine, the art dealer. Now, when we get to the end, or near the end, we turn left, and as we go through the door, it's this door over here, we go through this small foyer and into the room. Incidentally, before I show you the room, the foyer is at the top of the Manton stairs, which is where everyone meets for guided tours. So that's normally where I collect people. So I just walk along the corridor here, and when I'm giving a tour of this room, I come in and turn left, and these are the first paintings that I normally talk about. But what I'm going to do today, because as you walk into the room, you normally see the whole room. So let me give you a spin round the room. If we turn, we'll see some early Tudor works, including Elizabeth I there. Spin again, and we are coming up to some of the early Stuart work in James's reign, and then around again, and you'll notice they're arranged chronologically. There's the bust of Charles I, so we're in Charles's reign. There on the right, there is a portrait of Endymion Porter by William Dobson. And then finally, in our spin, there's a Van Dyke of the Killigrew family. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the works themselves, who's represented in the work, but also bring out this theme of the status of the artist. So let's go back to where we started. And let's start, well, before I show you this work in detail, I'm often asked when I take people around, is that Henry VIII? I suppose that this one here, I suppose it does look a bit like Henry VIII, but no, the first thing I can tell you, it's not Henry VIII. And the second thing is a bit more prescient. People sometimes say, is that by Holbein? We shall see. That it's a good question, but when you look at the label, you'll see that it's by a lesser known artist, better known at the time, but not very well known today, John Betts. But we don't know who the gentleman is in the picture. Man in a black cap is the sort of dull title it's been given. We let's just look at it briefly. The cap itself is painted fairly flatly. There's not much definition in the hat. The fur, as you can see, is painted with sort of flecks of the brush in a lighter brown to create the effect of fur. The beard is a sort of flat, I mean, the moustache is a lot better, but the beard is a flat structure with these little flecks in it. The background is a brown. I'll come back to the brown later because it's an important link. But we know the date of the painting, 1545, because it's written on the painting, always a good hint when you when you want to know the date of a painting. And but we don't know his age. Now that would be the text on the right, Etatis sue, and then it's cut off. And the reason it's cut off is because this is oil on oak panel, and we know the oak panel has been sawn off on the left and right and at the bottom, probably at some stage just to fit in an alcove somewhere. But when the Tate acquired it, it had already been sawn down. So we don't know his age. That might have helped a bit. We assume that he's a merchant class. And one of the reasons we assume that is because of the brown colouring of the background. But just one final point, on the back of the painting that is written on the oak panel is in Latin, but translated, made by John Betts, Englishman. So that's how we know it's by John Betts. But we also know John Betts because he appears in royal accounts, and we know other paintings by John Betts, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. But before I do, let's pick up on the brown background. It used to be blue, but it was painted using a pigment called smalt, S-M-A-L-T. Smalt is glass. You melt the glass, you mix in an ore, cobalt oxide, stir it up. Usually you pour the glass into cold water, which shatters it, and then you grind it up into a fine, not too fine, otherwise the color goes, but a fine a pigment that you mix with oil to create a blue, which they thought at the time was permanent. And we now know that in fact it sometimes is permanent, and there's a complex chemistry behind it. If there's too much potassium in the cobalt oxide, then over a few hundred years, the blue turns to brown. If there isn't, it stays blue. So you can't just go by the color. Sometimes the blue is still smalt. If it had a low, well, let's not get too technical about this. The reason I'm going into this is because smalt is cheap. And I wanted to show you another painting, which is Holbein, so that you could compare the two. I said I'd come back to this because in some ways, John Betts's style is a bit like Holbein. Look at the modeling of the face, the two faces. In other ways, it isn't. Look at the way Holbein has painted the fur and the way John Betts has painted the fur. But there's a clue. We think that John Betts might have trained in with Holbein, be trained by Holbein, that is, because John Betts uses a pink primer, and he's the only English artist to use a pink primer, and Holbein used a pink primer. So that there's a clue, if you like, that there's the style and the clue about the primer suggests that he might have been trained by Holbein, but a different artist. But and the blue, by the way, on Holbein's painting is aquamarine, or from the pigment called lapis lazuli, which is only found in Afghanistan. So it was very expensive to import, difficult to find, and by the ounce, it cost as much as gold. And having mentioned gold, you'll notice that Guildford's tunic is cloth of gold, and Holbein, in fact, used gold to paint it's shell gold to paint his tunic, and he actually even used a gold leaf to create the texture of the tunic. So with the aquamarine, the gold of the tunic, it was an expensive painting just in the materials used. And so coming back to the smalt, the cheap smalt, one of the reasons we think this is probably a merchant is that it wasn't as expensive to paint. The other way of looking at the status is the amount they got paid. Holbein was paid £30 a year and received extra for particular works. John Betts only received £3 for 6 paintings of the King and Queen that we know he did from the accounts. Just to give you an idea of what that means, a labourer, skilled to semi-skilled labourer, would earn £5 to £10 a year. And to become a knight, you had to earn a minimum of £40 a year, and typically a knight would have an income of £50 to £150 a year. Having said that, the very wealthy, like Guildford, could spend as much as, unusually, but they could spend as much as nearly £1,000 on one costume. Now, we don't know who the artist is here, but I thought I would just show you this because it's an interesting story behind the person who we're not quite sure who it is, but we think it's the West family. And the reason we think that is because there's a clue in the painting. Notice there's nothing written on the painting. There's no coat of arms or anything, but I'm just waiting for you to look at the painting, you'll notice that there's one thing on the painting that gives a clue, and I've got, I can expand on it, the ring. And you'll notice on the ring, there is a coat of arms, and it's the coat of arms of the West family. Now, we think from the age that it's William West. And when you look at the way he's looking at us, do you think this is a gentleman who would go to any lengths to get what he wanted? Well, if it is William West, then he was a nephew of the 9th Baron Delaware, and he tried, excuse me, to poison his uncle. It was detected, the uncle survived, and he was sent, William West was sent to the Tower in 1548, disbarred from all honours, but then Mary became queen and pardoned him 7 years later. And then in 1563, Elizabeth restored him in blood and knighted him and made him 1st Baron Delaware. I say first, although his uncle was the 9th Baron, because when his uncle had died in the meantime, and that baronetcy disappeared, and so Elizabeth effectively recreated it. So he became the 1st Baron, as it was a new title. The other way we can date paintings is the design of his clothes. There were a lot of changes in fashions in the Tudor period. This dates it to the 1550s. The pigments that were used roughly dates it to the 16th century. Interestingly, the design, I'm not an expert on this, but the design of his sword hilt dates it around about the 1550s. You might wonder about dendrochronology, dating the oak panel. All that tells us is when the tree was pulled down, cut down, and that was 1527, so some time before, because we think this was painted around about 1550. And then the final point I wanted, well, the second to last point I wanted to make is that I am saying Delaware. If you go to Bexhill-on-Sea, the pavilion there, the locals call the Delaware Pavilion, but I think the original pronunciation was Delaware, as in the US state, which was named after the family Delaware. Finally, when it was bought by the Tate, it was thought to be by Hans Holbein. And the reason is the stance. And this, you'll be familiar with this portrait. It's not actually by Holbein. The mural that Holbein painted in Whitehall Chambers was destroyed by a fire in 1698, but there had been copies made, and this is one maybe by his studio. But it's the stance. This akimbo stance is unusual, and so it was originally thought to be by Holbein, but we no longer think it is. Let's go on. I think I've got time. I think this is an important painting in terms of the artist. In fact, this painting and the one below it form a pair of the Kittsons, Lord and Lady Kittson. And Lady Kittson is painted here by George Gower, and it was George Gower really that I wanted to talk about, but just briefly, Lady Kittson was a recusant, that is, she followed the Roman Catholic faith and didn't obey the law, because we're now talking about Elizabeth I's reign, and the law was that you had to go to an Anglican service once a week or be fined 12 pence. Now, some Roman Catholics, like the Kittsons, refused, and so they were fined 12 pence, but often they didn't pay, they refused to pay, and so the fines went up, and in fact they could be imprisoned a lot better than Mary's reign, where they would have been burnt at the stake. Elizabeth's attitude is, we can tell from a famous alleged statement she made: "I would not open windows into men's souls," which means that she didn't really mind what people believed, as long as they followed the law and went to the church every week. And if they didn't, then they were fined or could be imprisoned. Now, the Kittsons were actually imprisoned, but surprisingly, Elizabeth visited their home at Hengrave Hall in Suffolk and knighted Sir Thomas Kittson, and he was therefore clearly still in favour with the Queen despite his beliefs. But I wanted to talk about George Gower. He was a leading portrait painter, in fact, the leading portrait painter of this period, because he became sergeant painter to Queen Elizabeth. The artists at the time spent a lot, they painted a few portraits and they became increasingly popular, but remember, there wasn't any colour printing, and there are lots of festivals, and what they needed artists and artist studios to do is to paint banners, paint cloth for festivals, and various other ornamentation for different events. So that's in one reason why they were seen as artisans, because that was the majority of the work they did. But things were changing, and George Gower, is known also, to make a local point, as the person who painted, in fact, repainted the clock at the astronomical clock at Hampton Court in 1575. It was installed 35 years before that. And what I really wanted to tell you about, though, is his family, which had a coat of arms. His father was Sir John Gower. And look at this device next to his self-portrait. You can see some scales on, it's called an impresa, a visual device, which the Elizabethans loved puzzles and visual puzzles. So you have to work this one out. This one's a fairly simple one. And the text above it tells you the answer anyway. The pair of scales is weighed down by some dividers on the pan on the left. And dividers were seen to be one of the tools of an artist. In the other pan, there's his coat of arms, the family coat of arms. So what this is saying is he regards art as more important than his coat of arms, than the family coat of arms. A very bold statement to make at the time. Although the status of artists was starting to improve, it hadn't really improved that much. So that was an important symbolic message regarding status. Now, this is an interesting, I could spend a long time on this painting. It's unfortunately, I believe, since I haven't been to the Tate in the last year, I believe it's been removed because it wasn't owned by the Tate, it was on loan to the Tate. It's got a complex history, but for example, up to September, things changed quickly in the art world. September last year, it was thought to be by the famous painter Stephen, because that's how it was described in an inventory later in the next century. But, and two Stephens, so we don't know which Stephen, there's two famous Stephens. There's Stephen van der Meulen and Stephen Herwig. But we now believe, because of an article that was written by Edward Town in September last year, that it's by George Gower. I haven't had a chance to read the article yet, but I notice it's officially being now stated as George Gower. But that's a bit of an aside. More importantly is, what is this painting about? It's the only painting of it. Well, first of all, it's the first full-length painting of Elizabeth after she became queen, and she didn't like having her portrait painted. One reason, I think, is this quote. She wrote in a letter to Edward in 1547, "For the face, I grant, I might well blush to offer, but the mind I shall never be ashamed to present." So she didn't think much of her looks and didn't really want herself portrayed. And this is also the only painting really where she presents herself not as the Virgin Queen, but as a monarch ready to be married. And how do we know that? She's holding a carnation or gillyflower in her right hand, and that is a symbol of betrothal. It, like many symbols in the Tudor period, it can mean many things. I'll give you another example. On the right here, behind her, is a tapestry of cloth of gold that includes her coat of arms. So she's saying she is, in fact, she was the most eligible female monarch in Europe. And she's presenting herself. This over here, these fruit and flowers over here, is another tapestry. And it's a tapestry showing fruit and flowers that symbolize fertility. For example, this pomegranate here was a well-known symbol for fertility, but it also was a symbol for Christ's resurrection. It also was a symbol, as some of you probably know, of the Aragon family. So Catherine of Aragon used it. But when you look at this picture, or when they looked at this picture in the Tudor period, they never would have made that connection, because they knew which meaning was intended. And what this intends to mean with all these fruit and flowers is that here's a queen that is looking for a partner and is fertile and is looking forward to marriage. Why? Because she never got married. Well, a few years before, she caught smallpox. In fact, she caught smallpox at Hampton Court and almost died. And the courtiers and Parliament became extremely worried that there was no designated successor. So they thought the best solution was to encourage her to get married and to have an heir. So she had this painting was produced to circulate around Europe to present her as an eligible person to the princes of Europe. Final point I'm going to make here is notice that her face has no shadows. Remember the John Betts and the Holbein, the modeling of the face? Here we see it flat. Now, many different reasons have been presented for this. It was fashion, it was the makeup, it was to hide her smallpox scars. But I have a different theory. If you look at the book written by Elizabeth's limner, painter of miniatures, Nicholas Hilliard, who was the leading miniaturist or limner, as they would have said at the time, in England, wrote a book called The Art of Limning. And in it, he has a dialogue with the Queen. When he painted the Queen's portrait, he chatted to her and he put that dialogue in the book. And I've abbreviated it down to one short section, which is that the Queen said, according to Hilliard, the Queen said, the Italians, who had the name to be the cunningest and draw best, shadowed not. And Hilliard says he said to her, oh yes, I completely agree, Your Majesty. Maybe we should go outside and you can sit under a tree where there won't be a strong shadows created by the sun. And so it's possible that Elizabeth's misunderstanding, because obviously the Italians, think of Michelangelo, Titian, used a lot of shadowing to model the face. Maybe Elizabeth got it wrong and no one ever liked to correct her. So henceforth, portraits were painted flat. Incidentally, talking about portraits, this is another long aside, but I'll keep it brief to just this one quote, which was issued. Well, it's a proclamation in draft. We don't know whether it was issued, but it gives you an idea of what was happening. Everyone wanted a portrait of Elizabeth to put in their country estate, but no one knew what she looked like. And so artists would just make up what she looked like and people would hang that. So it was decided, because some of these portraits were terrible and looked nothing like her, that some special person shall, by her allowed, shall have first finished a portrait thereof, after which finished, Her Majesty will be content that all other painters, printers, gravers, shall and may, at their pleasure, follow the said patron or first portrait. In other words, what it was decided was that one artist, her court painter, probably Gower, would paint one portrait and then everybody else would copy that portrait. So at least if they could copy well, they would be accurate. Let's move on though. There's more to say about that portrait. It's a very well-known portrait. Unfortunately, it's in private ownership now, and I think has gone from the Tate. Let's look at this one because it's a fun picture, but also there's a story behind it linked to Elizabeth and the type of person she was, the other side of Elizabeth. This is Captain Thomas Lee, painted by another famous artist of the period, a Flemish artist who worked at the Tudor court, called Marcus Gerrits. Marcus Gerrits the Younger, this is. Some people think he was one of the most important artists to work between Hans Ewert or George Gower and Van Dyke. But the first thing you notice is why has he got bare legs? And then the second thing you notice is, why is his left wrist, why is his wrist or hand falling limply? And there are good reasons for both. Let's start with the legs. Well, he'd just come back from Ireland, and it was known that Irish soldiers had bare legs to walk through the bogs. But they didn't have such a fancy costume as him. This is a very expensive costume he's wearing, fine lace, this engraved Spanish helmet, the pistol that he's carrying. These are all signs of wealth. So the bare legs express the Irish connection and humility, and we'll see why he has to express humility in a moment. But he's also pointing out that he's wealthy. The wrist is because it's difficult to see, but there's a little scar going across his hand because he injured his wrist and hand in a fire, which destroyed some of his property. The important thing is what's written in the tree behind here. And the Elizabethans would recognize this, that what's actually written is an abbreviation of what's from Livy's History of Rome, and it translates as both to do and suffer strong things is Roman, or better translated, both to act and suffer with fortitude is a Roman's part. And what does that mean? Well, in Livy, it's part of the section where he talks about a Roman called Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who dresses as the enemy and enters their camp to spy. He's caught, and to show that he can't be tortured, he thrusts his hand into the fire and leaves it there. And this so impresses his captors that they, and tells them what Romans are like, that this has been written by Livy, of course, that it goes down in history. So why is he referring to Romans? Because he's in deep trouble. When he went to Ireland, against the explicit instructions of Elizabeth, he tried to make a pact with the Irish warlord, the Earl of Tyrone, and it fell through. The Earl of Tyrone started attacking the English. So when he came back, he was in trouble, potentially to be executed for treason, for disobeying Elizabeth. So this is a clever attempt to win her round, and we think that it was paid for by his uncle, who was Sir Henry Lee, Elizabeth's champion at the joust. So he acted for her at the joust. And we know that Marcus Gerrits was a patron, was Sir Henry Lee. And so we think it was Sir Henry Lee, who was a very bright chap, came up with this link. And Elizabeth must have been amused by it because she didn't execute him for treason. But then what happened? The denouement. His patron, that is Captain Lee's patron in Ireland, was Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, who was as unpredictable as Lee. And you might know he was a favourite of Elizabeth, but following a bad campaign in Ireland, he was placed under house arrest. And then he led a sort of an abortive coup d'etat. And when he was imprisoned, awaiting execution, this chap, Captain Thomas Lee, suggested to a friend that they confine Elizabeth, lock her in a room basically, until she'd signed an order to release the Earl of Essex. That's treason. So what happened was his friend told the authorities, he was arrested the same day and executed the next morning. So I said I would give the other side of Elizabeth. She was tough. And then another painting that everybody wants to see is this one. I'll only we don't know the painter, we don't know who the ladies are. We know they're from the Cholmondeley family, but it's a fun painting. When you see it across the room, it looks as though they're twins, but they're certainly not identical twins, because if you look, they've got different coloured eyes. One's blue eyes, one's brown eyes. And then if you look carefully, you'll see that the babies are dressed differently, the swaddling clothes are different, and the women are dressed differently. And also we know there are no twins in the Cholmondeley family at this time, no twins at all, identical or otherwise. So we now think maybe it's a woman of the Cholmondeley family and a friend. And on the painting, if you look here, on the painting it says, two ladies of the Cholmondeley family who were born the same day, married the same day, and brought to bed, that is, gave birth the same day. So the two babies are exactly the same age. And so maybe this was just painted to illustrate their friendship. And it was, I don't know about amusing, but it was a sort of typical Tudor sort of play with ideas. This painting is important in my telling of the story of the status of artists, because notice we've moved on. This is 1623, so we're in the Stuart period. This is James Hamilton. Now the Hamiltons were in fact, they were next in line to the Scottish throne after the Stuarts, and they had immense land holdings in Scotland, a very wealthy family, and they came down to England with James I when he formed his court in England. James VI of Scotland, of course, and James I of England. Now, James Hamilton is interesting to us today because he was a very early collector of paintings. He collected something like 600. But there's another link here. The artist, Daniel Mytens, was, his patron was Thomas Howard, the Collector Earl, the 14th, or some say, depends how you measure it, the 21st Earl of Arundel. And Daniel Mytens, in fact, painted a well-known portrait of the Earl of Arundel and his wife Alethea. He was called the Collector Earl because he was the first person in England to collect art seriously, and that changed the attitude towards art substantially. He was the first to go on a grand tour. We believe he took Inigo Jones with him to, that's not proven, but we believe he did, to Italy. He collected over 700 paintings, but he also collected sculpture, books, prints, drawings, antique jewellery, and he documented them all thoroughly. So he was a serious collector. James Hamilton just collected them because they were becoming, they were extremely sort of valuable and becoming more and more rated. But the biggest collector, of course, in England was Charles I. He collected something like 2,000 works. When he was beheaded, his works, and also James Hamilton was beheaded, so his works as well were sold abroad. James Hamilton's collection is now in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. So in terms of artists, the attitude towards art and towards artists completely changed during James, and then particularly during Charles's reign, as all of the many aristocrats started to collect paintings seriously and buy them in Europe and pay more and more for them. So Charles became a collector of, for example, Titian, Mantegna, Holbein, Dürer, and many others. And he was, well, I'll tell you more about Van Dyke later, but by the time Van Dyke arrived in England, the status of artists and of art was very high. Daniel Meitens was actually trained in the Netherlands. He wasn't an English artist, but he came to England and worked in England for the rest of his life. And he was commissioned, as well as by the Collector Earl, he was also commissioned by James I and by Charles, and he became the leading court painter until Van Dyke arrived. He was also the Hamilton, that is. Hamilton was one of those that went with Charles to Italy on the weird, the strange, abortive trip across Europe to woo the Spanish princess, the Infanta Maria. But so he was, James Hamilton was well connected with Charles, and they collected together, as the other one in the party was the Duke of Buckingham. But let's move on. That's just to set the scene of the improving status of artists. And there's another angle on it here with the painting at the end of the room. This is interesting because Nathaniel Bacon, I believe he is the first serious amateur artist, and it's Sir Nathaniel Bacon, and he was the 9th son of Nicholas Bacon, the premier baronet of England. So although he was the 9th son, he was wealthy and from a wealthy family, extremely wealthy family, I should say. And he was interested in art. He was the first aristocrat to take up painting as a gentlemanly accomplishment. So what do we have here? Well, the first thing is all this fruit and veg. This is the first painting of this type in England, but it was very common in the Netherlands. Let me show you a painting in the National Gallery, the one on the left. This was by a Dutch artist, Berkelaar, Joachim Berkelaar, and there are 4 paintings in the National Gallery by him representing the 4 elements, and I'm just showing you earth because it's similar to the Bacon painting. We can see, I think I probably need to point out that it's also a religious painting. The Bacon isn't, but the Berkelaar is. But it's very hard to see in this reproduction. You can see in the original painting. These, let me point out why. These 2 women here are buying fruit and veg. This couple back here are selling the fruit and veg because they're by a well and washing it to look in good condition. And then the religious element is hidden away at the back. Crossing this bridge at the back is the Holy Family. It's the flight into Egypt. It's Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus flying, escaping, I should say, into Egypt to escape from Herod. So this painting, however, is purely a painting of fruit and vegetables. And he had another reason why he was interested in this. He was interested in gardening, or that might be the wrong word, in horticulture, because he employed hundreds of gardeners. It was an accomplishment, I think is probably the right word, of gentlemen who could import the most exotic plants from around the world, who could force them to grow earlier than anyone else. They were some of the challenges of being a gentleman horticulturalist. And that was an accepted accomplishment of gentlemen. It costs a lot of money. Back here, you can see whoops. Go back to the painting. In the background, through the door, you can see a heap of manure, which was used to force the plants. So they had a lot of techniques they used to bring on things early. But in terms of painting, you can see, I won't go through all the different produce, but it's from around the world, and some of it is very exotic. You might find it in a supermarket today, but in those days it was exotic. But the interesting thing to me is that Nathaniel Bacon has painted floors in his prize-winning fruit and veg here, that you can see holes in the kraut cabbages. Over here, there's a good one up here. You can see I've done it again. It's because I'm tapping. You can see on the apple and the pear on the far left, there are bird marks in the fruit. And there's also one, I think, in the plum above them. In other words, he wasn't painting perfect fruit, which he could have done. He was painting the fruit accurately. However, of course, it's not accurate because we see fruit and veg from across the year. So he's being honest in one sense, but assembling a collection of fruit and veg that couldn't normally be assembled. Incidentally, at the time he painted this in the early 1620s, it was famine in most of the country. It was very bad harvest, 1623, 24. In fact, people died. It was described as the last peacetime famine in England, not in Great Britain, in England. And final point I need to make is you might be wondering about the buxom woman and the significance of that, because you'll have noticed that in the Flemish painting, the women were covered. There's a number of theories. One is it was fashionable, and it was fashionable to have very low cut dresses at the time. Another theory is it's simply to emphasize the fruitfulness of nature, and or it's drawing attention to the melon or the link between her breasts and the melon. But also it's been suggested that Nathaniel Bacon was very well read, and particularly in Renaissance Italy, many fruit and vegetable had sexual connotations. They were used as sexual metaphors. I won't go into detail. So it could be that. Horace Walpole, but he was writing 140 years later, in his Anecdotes of Painting in England, described the woman as a goddess. He described her as Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture. So there's another explanation. So let's go around the room to the reign of Charles. There's a bust of Charles. Let's see how much time I've got. And I think I might have time for 3 more. So the interesting thing about the bust of Charles is that there's a local connection, and also it's sculpture, which I haven't covered up to now. And it's an interesting artist. Herbert Lesueur was a French-born sculptor who arrived in London in 1626 and went into the King's service and produced a number of works, one with a local connection to this area, which I'll come on to. This work, the bust, was donated to the city of Chichester by the King in the Civil War, to honour Chichester because it was a royalist town. And in fact, it's now in Pallant House. It was in the Market Square in Chichester, but it's in Pallant House, and it's on loan to the Tate. So we're thankful for that. Now, Lesueur also painted, you might recognise this. This is the famous equestrian portrait of Charles I. That's at the south end of Trafalgar Square, just at the top of Whitehall. Now, this equestrian statue of Charles was completed in 1633, and it was thought by Cromwell to have been destroyed. It was bought by a scrap metal dealer who said he had melted it down, destroyed it, and in fact he hadn't. He was a secret royalist, and he buried it, must have been a big hole, he buried it in his garden, and then during the restoration of Charles, or as soon as Charles II was restored to the throne, he dug it up and presented it to Charles II, who put it back on display, and it's still on display. The other work that Lesueur was involved in, and he was involved in a number, but the other one I wanted to mention was this one, Diana Fountain. We call it the Diana Fountain, but in fact, we now believe, a lot of research has been done into this, we now believe it was designed by Inigo Jones in 1633 for the garden of Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, in Old Somerset House. And it had a central naked figure of the water goddess, Arethusa. I'll get it right in a minute. And maybe I call it Diana. And it was, the figures on the fountain were sculpted by Lesueur, and the clothed figure in the centre, I think I've got the clothed figure was a decision, we believe, made by Lesueur, probably maybe under Henrietta Maria or Charles's instruction, and it was later moved to Hampton Court and has stood in Bushy Park since 1713. It doesn't have any of the attributes of Diana that you'd normally expect, like a bow and arrow or a crescent moon or hunting dogs. So it's now believed it's not of Diana, but there is a link to Lesueur and to this work in currently in the Tate. William Dobson is the artist I want to talk about because he was the first notable English painter described by the diarist John Aubrey at the time, or a bit later, as the most excellent painter that England has yet bred, and also described in a recent TV program by Waldemar Januszczak as the first British-born genius, the first truly dazzling English painter. So the status of artists was improving dramatically. Let me tell you who he's painted. Endymion Porter we see here, and he was a close associate of Charles I, a supporter of Charles I. Incidentally, even though he didn't believe in any of his policies, he felt that he had to and truly supported the king. And we see him with a musket or shooting rifle. We see a hair on the arm of his servant being sniffed by a dog. And in the background, we see a sculpture of Apollo, the god of the arts, because he was also, Endymion Porter was also a great supporter of the arts. As I've already told you, many aristocrats were at the time, many driven by wanting to impress Charles I. And here, on the other side, he's leaning on a bas-relief, which illustrates the arts. What we see is, on the left, a painting, or I should say personification of painting, holding a palette and brushes, and is supporting a canvas on which she has just painted an image of the small figure in the center, which is a sculpture of Minerva, the goddess of the arts, that has just been created by the figure in the middle, which is the personification of sculpture. And on the right is poetry, who is, I assume, writing a poem about the about Minerva. The we have a portrait of William Dobson that he painted in the 1630s. Now, both Dobson and Endymion Porter were royalist supporters of the king, and when the king, or after the king was beheaded, Dobson lost his clientele. He in fact painted this portrait of Endymion Porter in Oxford, when which was a royalist town, when many supporters of Charles were in the town. Dobson went round painting their portraits, and after the execution, Dobson came back to London, couldn't find any work, was put into prison for debt, and died shortly after, age 37. There were something like 60 paintings by Dobson still in existence, however. And then finally, I come on to Van Dyke and the status of artists. This is actually a pair of paintings put together or reunited for the first time by the Tate for the first time in 150 years. They became separate. They were painted to be shown together, and they were sold separately, and the Tate bought both of them and reunited them in 2002. The separation maybe reflects the fact that during the Civil War, the couple were forced to live separately during the Civil War, partly because of poverty, and they were reunited following the Restoration, but later their portraits were separated. It's the Killigrews. It's Sir William Killigrew and his wife, Mary Hill, Lady Killigrew. Now, let me talk about the art first. And we know that Van Dyke was born in Antwerp and was trained in the studio of Peter Paul Rubens, and came to England in 1620, but only for a year. He went back to Europe in 1621 and then travelled around Europe, mostly Italy, where he studied the works of many Italian Renaissance artists, particularly Titian and other Venetian painters. Then in 1632, he returned to England. I'll tell you more about that, but just explore the Titian angle. This portrait of Sir William Killigrew is often likened to a Titian work. This work, which is in the National Gallery, portrait of Gerolamo Barbarigo, and it's the stance, to some extent the look, although in Titian's painting the figure is looking directly at us, but also this this sort of parapet that they're both resting on. Now, the Sir William Killigrew is wearing black, and there are two possible reasons. One is that he's in mourning, although it does have cut white sleeves showing, but there is a ring. Can you see there's a ring in the center that is tied to, this may allude romantically to his wife, or it may allude to a friend or relative, and the relationship through the ring. But the other possibility, he's wearing black because he's expressing this idea of melancholy. Well, there was a fashion for melancholy, and I could say a lot, it's one of the humours, but let me just say that it was a fashionable stance for artistically inclined people in particular, and Sir William Killigrew later became a playwright. and it was a fashion throughout Europe to some extent, but particularly in England, it was called the English malady. So that's one possibility. And then the portrait of his wife, incidentally, that it was fashionable to wear low-cut dresses, is this portrait in the National Gallery, a portrait of a lady. The Schiavona refers to her nationality. Both are looking directly at us. Both have a sort of a frontal stance, and it was unusual at this time to paint such, well, it was particularly when, I should say, by this time, I mean when Titian painted his painting in 1510, more than 100 years previously, it was very unusual to paint a woman looking directly out at the viewer. So that may have been an inspiration. And let me tell you a bit more, to finish off, a bit more about Van Dyke and his status. I said he came back to England in 1632. In order not to lose him again, Charles immediately knighted him and increased his salary and paid him £200 a year. Now, remember the figures I gave you before, Holbein, £30 a year, £3 for the paintings by John Betts. There hadn't been much inflation in the previous 100 years. So £200 was the sort of salary a wealthy knight could live on and do well. And he did well. He wore gold chains wherever he went. He's wearing one here. He wore gentlemanly clothing. He wore a sword, which was a sign of a gentleman. He always had servants following him wherever he went. He was accompanied by servants to show his wealth. And he became the #1 painter. Remember I said Daniel Muytens was the king's painter. When Van Dyke arrived, he painted a similar painting to one that Muytens had painted, but it was so much better that Muytens got no more work. Everybody switched to Van Dyke, who influenced English art for the next 150 years. I mean, he influenced Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough, and so on. And to cap it all, when he died, he was the first artist to be buried with ceremony in St. Paul's Cathedral. And that ends my talk. I hope you'll soon be able to visit the Tate. It's currently due to reopen. Let me just give the date, on the 17th of May, if nothing changes. And in the meantime, I hope my short tour has brought a little of the Tate magic into your homes. Thank you.
It really has. It's been as realistic as I think it could possibly be, given the circumstances. And we haven't had to jostle with crowds to get really good views of the paintings. And I watch on an iPad. I can pinch out and see details and things, which I'd be arrested if I got that close in the gallery, probably. So I have to admit, in my ignorance for Tudor and Stuart portraits, I have in the past. It's closed now, long term for a refurb, isn't it? I've always gone to the National Portrait Gallery and didn't really realise this little room was there. So I will be off to that room as soon as I can. You've talked about pigments, you've talked about classical literature, we've had dollopings of history and politics, so thank you for that. And actually the very early picture you looked at with the brown background was fascinating, because we had an entire lecture on the pigment blue recently, so that was a little revision in malt and lapis lazuli, and how difficult it is to make blues without enormous expenditure. I'm just going to check whether
There's just one.
Right. So yeah, Lisa Etheridge has a question for us. Wonderful, thank you. Why was Van Dyke pointing at the sunflower in his self-portrait?
We don't know. My guess is that he's saying, "Look what I can do." He's wearing his finest, so he's not dressed as a painter. He's not holding a palette, but he's pointing out he's a painter because he's painting. He's pointing at a sunflower, but it's not a sunflower. It's a painting of a sunflower. So it's one of these clever tricks of
Paragoni,
a painting within a painting sort of thing, or raising questions about the nature of painting and reality.
Yeah,
that's my take on it.
I'm just going to have another look. No, somebody said of that, the very early one, I think it was the painting with the brown background. Somebody very early on, Liz, commented that it was a very contemporary looking face.
Yes, the one that some people who go around mistake for Henry VIII.
Yeah.
The John Betts, man in a black cap. Yeah. Yes, a solid sort of square looking face. A certain.
Now, Mr. Olmers Anonymous says, what happened to artists during the Cromwellian period?
Different things. There was some painting done, but not as much as before, because it was frowned upon, because it was seen by the Puritans as an expression of vanity. And although the churches have been stripped of art 100 years before, at the Reformation, they went round again during the Cromwellian period and took out literally everything, and people were destroyed works in their homes. But there were some people who liked art who still had portraits painted because they have a use in remembering people and so on. So they have a practical use, and Cromwell had his portrait painted. So there were some artists that survived through the Cromwellian period and out the other end. Yeah. But there was less work around.
And interesting what you said about the improving status of artists, but actually when they came to the sale of the late king's goods, paintings were valued very low. If I had a time machine, I'd come back and buy some of those things that were sold off at very low prices, because the people that organised the sale didn't seem to know the value of paintings. They were much more familiar with.
A 2-hour lecture on this. It's
I read a very long tome on it.
Yes, I've got a couple of books. It's such an interesting period, and you're right. To settle the king's debts, they gave the man in the street, the candlestick maker, paintings by Titian and Dürer and so on, and they sold them off for what they could get, a few pounds. Yeah. However, there were also some more wealthy people who saw what they would be worth and bought them and kept them and made an absolute fortune later on in the sale. Yeah. Some of the works were sold for 500, or I think one by over £1,000.
Yeah. So it's brought our wonderful morning of looking at paintings to an end. Thank you a million times, Lawrence. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. And fingers crossed that there are no more changes to Boris's roadmap, and we really will be back in those galleries mid-May, and looking forward to lots of great exhibitions coming up later this year all over. I don't know what Tate's got planned. What's coming up at the Tate? Exhibition-wise,
the Tate is May the 17th, if nothing changes, and they've already sent us the details of how we can do it in a COVID safe way. It will be limited. It will only be one painting we're talking about, but for a slightly longer period, like 20 minutes on one painting.
So you group round it and spread out. Yeah. Apparently the National Gallery has put lots of paintings into storage, so the paintings are a bit socially distanced as well.
Right, yeah.
But there we go. Thank you very much. Loads of thanks coming in from all around the country, Manchester and all over.
Okay.
And just remains for me to say once again, Lawrence, thank you very much for such an authoritative tour. It was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Bye
Bye-bye.
now.